And what was it like when you saw the Holy Father, John the 23rd, came on the Sedia Gestatoria? Isn't that correct?
That's correct. He did use the Sedia that occasion. There were many occasions when he didn't use it because it made him feel seasick. So he would often stop the procession, get off and walk instead.
Is that right?
In fact, one little incident, I got to know a family at Natuno where there's a cemetery for Americans who lost their lives at Anzio Beachhead. And the mother was a teacher of second graders. And she took her second graders to see the Pope one time, how they put up those temporary barricades about this high down the middle of St. Peter's. And as the Pope was coming down that walking, one of her little students blurted out, "Ecco la ciccia," which in Italian means the little flabby, the little butterball.
Yeah.
And the Pope heard it and stopped and came over and talked to this little girl. And this woman was dying 1,000 deaths because her student had called the Pope a little fatty.
And he was truly a butterball.
Yeah, but I mean, he always created a sort of a murmur in the crowd because people loved him. They called him their nonno, which is, you know, Italian, a very familiar, loving name to call your grandpa. So he was their grandpa.
So tell us, as we begin this 50th anniversary of the Vatican Council convening, tell us, what was it like living in Rome during those years?
I guess the single word I would use to say is like there was a buzz, a silent buzz all over the city, because everyone was aware of what was happening at St. Peter's. And in fact, that was true not only in St. Peter's, but throughout the world. And the newspapers daily were filled with all kinds of reports and little vignettes and incidents of things that had happened. So everyone is sort of in the periphery of their consciousness. They were aware that this was happening. And we always eagerly awaited whatever the scuttlebutt was each evening.
Do you have any of those scuttlebutts that you could share with us? One that perhaps surprised you, or that you thought was particularly humorous?
Keep in mind that the bishops, unlike in this country, where they all have a chauffeur and are chauffeured to wherever they're going, they were collected from all the places they were living, convents, colleges, and so on. They were collected in school buses and brought to the council. And just to see the bishops being, brought like schoolboys almost to the council. Well, anyway, one day when they were coming out of the council, there's quite a number of steps that come down from the front of the basilica, and one of the bishops collapsed on those steps, and a whole bunch of bishops gathered around and bent over him. And the report was that one of them was heard to say, "Would someone please get a priest?" So we all had a good chuckle over that one.
Because certainly this was a revolutionary council. They called it a revolution.
It really was a revolution, yeah. That many gathered for that many years to deal with things so openly. And Pope John had insisted that it be an open discussion and that he would not dictate what was to be done. In fact, he also allowed them such freedom that the Curia, which thought they were going to control the whole council, within the first 2 weeks found out that they weren't.
They were not.
No, they were not.
So in the middle of this revolution, what would you say, for you at least, as a seminarian? Are you a seminarian? Or
no, I was ordained already.
You were newly ordained priest?
Yeah, I was ordained in 1960.
So as a newly ordained priest, truly, what would you say was the most surprising either moment or teaching or of that time for you?
I think the most surprising, I had grown up in the pre-Vatican II church and was formed as a young boy and as a seminarian and ultimately as a theologian and priest in the understandings of the church at that time, where the church was, some use the image of a fortress, but I think of it as parochial. It was sort of a community that kept itself apart from the mainstream of life. And to have a council, and by the way, also the theology I learned in my seminary studies was basically neo-scholastic, very medieval. And for example, we had a 5-semester hour course in Eucharist and never once talked about what we do in church. It was all abstract philosophical principles. Well, anyway, to hear as the council began to unfold all the ways in which that long tradition was being reassessed, how can we be faithful to the tradition, but also how can it be updated and made relevant to today's world? That was a huge surprise and a very welcome surprise for me.
Sure. And it was surprising because because there was a thought that it wasn't going to, this council would just be same old, same old?
That was a lot of the expectation in Rome, especially in the curial circles, that it would simply reaffirm the tradition and not do much to change things. But one of John's goals for the Pope John's goals for the council was that it would actually reinvigorate the church by recovering the essential parts of tradition and then making them relevant, updated. Ressourcement and aggiornamento were his two key words, yeah.
Now, from your neo-scholastic studies, did you do those in Rome as well?
No. Well, I did my seminary studies in this country.
In this country?
In fact, in a predecessor school to CTU, one of the schools that became part of CTU. But in Rome, it was more historical, but still heavily medieval.
And in those studies, because you were in the middle of your doctorate during this time, did anything shift as a result of the council percolating this new sense of aggiornamento? Did you notice in your own doctoral studies things shifting midstream for you, or?
No, since it was heavily historical.
Okay.
There
Your
wasn't
work.
much. Yes, it was. There wasn't a real significant shift, except that when I was working on sacramental theology, my director asked me to give an account of what's being said in sacramental theology, and that was when Christ as sacrament, Church as sacrament, that thought was just beginning to become popular.
Sure.
So I mean, I saw a real shift there, but it wasn't so much in the curriculum, in the classwork that I did, as in my own studies.
In your own studies.
And contextualizing the medieval period, and then seeing that there could be different ways of approaching tradition, and then gradually learning what some of the contemporary theologians are saying about sacraments.